Welcome. Lovely to see you all here, and I hope you're all keeping dry under the canopy. So, this panel is called No Place Like Home, and we've got a lineup of the most incredible authors here. We're so privileged to have them here, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves because I won't do them justice. But they are all written books. One is non-fiction, the other's a fiction, with home and belonging at the centre of their stories. So I'm going to start with Christy.
No, I didn't take that chair because I didn't want to go first.
And she shouldn't have told me that.
I thought you were joking. I'm going to remember that. Okay, shall I go first? Okay. So, I'm Christy. I've just learnt a good lesson. So, I'm Christy Lefteri. I've had 3 books published. My first was A Watermelon, a Fish and a Bible, which was published about 10 years ago. And then recently, The Beekeeper of Aleppo, and very recently, as in 2 weeks ago, Songbirds came out, which is my latest novel. So I'll just tell you a little bit about Songbirds. It's very much inspired by a situation in Cyprus where 5 women and 2 children went missing. And the authorities absolutely refused to search for them because they were foreign. And what actually transpired in the end was very sad. I won't go into that. But it eventually broke open some really disturbing underlying issues that existed, not only in Cyprus, but in other places, about sort of institutionalized racism and the way that people are objectified. So these domestic workers were making huge sacrifices to travel to places like Cyprus, to leave their homes in order to try and find a way of making a better life for their families. And so the story is very much about entrapment. So the main character, Nisha, she finds a way from Sri Lanka to Cyprus in order to give her daughter a better life, but finds herself trapped. And also there's the theme of the migrating birds who are migrating from Europe to Africa and stopping in Cyprus along the way, and getting trapped on these lime sticks and these mist nets. So I won't say more than that, but it's very much about kind of migration and borders and what it means to make that decision to migrate and where that can lead people, and how the end result might be a lot different to what people imagined when they make the decision to actually make those journeys, like the birds as well. So anyway, I won't say more, but that's.
Thank you. And I think Songbirds has just gone into the Sunday Times bestseller list.
Yeah.
So congratulations.
Thank you.
Florence.
Hi, I'm Florence. My book is the only non-fiction book here, and it's a memoir, and it's about my journey through life. I was a child of the 60s. My parents were West African students from Nigeria, and I happened to be born in an era where lots of West African students of that time, for a number of reasons, which I won't go into right now, but in order to be able to study and work, because most of them were self-funding students, they privately fostered their children to white families. So I'm one of a generation of an estimated 3,000 black African children who grew up in white homes for a while. So I lived with my foster mother and her family, and I was the only black child for miles. When I was 6, my parents finished their studies. They picked me up from my foster family and they took me back to Nigeria. And that's when the real journey starts, because I arrive on African soil. I do not speak the language. I do not know the customs. And the cultures couldn't be further apart in terms of their expectations of children and their expectations of women. And so I go through a period all the way through to adulthood, to early adulthood, where all I'm living for is how to get back to England. And then I finally make it back, and I find out that England is not the utopia I thought it would be. So that's it in a nutshell.
Thank you. Melody?
Hi, I'm Melody. My debut novel is Moth, and it's the story of a Brahmin family who are living in Delhi in 1940s India during the Indian partition. and it shows the narrative tells the story of the family as the family fall apart, as the country is ruptured and divided, and the youngest daughter goes missing, and the family are left with the whole of her not being there. And then the story then shifts into where she is and what's happening to her, and it deals with the human resistance and how especially women, how they survive in times of extreme trauma.
Thank you. Neema?
Yeah, hi, I'm Neema Shah, and my debut novel, Kololo Hill, came out in February. It's set during 1972, during the Ugandan Asian expulsion by President Idi Amin, when 80,000 Ugandan Asians were expelled. And it's focused on one particular family who are given 90 days, like the others, to leave. And I really wanted to look at migration, obviously, but what that does to people, how it changes you, but also what we take and what we leave behind, both emotionally and physically. So yeah, it's about the forces that shape us as a result of something like that. So yeah, that's my book.
Rosanna?
So my book is the Book of Echoes, and it's narrated by an enslaved African woman that died over 200 years ago. And she follows the story of Michael, who's based in Brixton, and Ngozi, who's based in Nigeria. And for me, it was an exploration of the impact of generational trauma that comes from slavery that down the line, but also an exploration of self-love, self-value, and the resilience of the people that they represent.
Thank you. So I think in the last 18 months, the concept of home has probably changed in different ways for each and every one of us, whether we've been in our own homes or stuck in a home that isn't necessarily ours. So I wanted to throw this out to all of you, is the inspiration behind your books, because there is a really strong theme of belonging and home in each of these books, whether it's a memoir or fiction. So can I just ask each of you, why did you decide to write them? I can pick on someone if you like.
Okay, I'll go first. I think for me, when I first started writing, it was just one of those things. I remember sharing parts of my story with people, and they said, "Oh, that's really interesting. You should write about that." So I had that for years and years, and then when I started writing, it was probably more for the catharsis in terms of just being able to get all that trauma out on paper. But then once I got over myself, as it were, and I started to look around me, at that time, I was a teacher by trade, and at that point in time, I was a head teacher of a primary school in inner London. And I realized that a lot of the children under my care were actually going through similar experiences in terms of being caught between two different cultures and having to code switch between those cultures and try and be something different at home to what they were at school. And some people do that seamlessly and they just get on with life, but for others it poses a particular challenge, and I started to recognize that in some of those children that I was working with. So the motivation for the book then became more of getting that story out so that parents who are raising children across cultures can become more aware of the fact that children do not always necessarily seamlessly process that, and that they need help sometimes in order to be able to sort of sort out who they are, their identity, because the children who fail to do that, the consequences can be traumatic or tragic.
And did writing this book help you in your own mind?
It did. I think it did in that it allowed me to get those emotions out on paper. And actually, if there was anything I learned about myself through the process, is that I'd spent a lifetime of suppressing those emotions and just keeping them deep down. My policy was, get on with it, get on with life, move on, next thing. And I never really stopped to process those emotions or how they shaped me as an individual.
That's a really good point. I can pick on someone, or you can go. I'm really scared to pick on Christy again because I feel so bad about doing it the first time.
It's all right. I don't mind going next. I just don't like going first. So I think what I'd like to mention is a friendship I had, which really inspired me when I wrote this book, and it was with a woman called Amaka, who was a domestic worker for a family member that I used to stay with for many years. So I'd see her every year and we developed this really lovely friendship. And I remember when I arrived in Cyprus, the very first time I met her, I was going through divorce. So I was in the process of actually moving home, moving out of the home that I was living in. Just, you know, my whole life was just a mess. And I met her, and the first time I met her, I woke up in the morning and she was like, "Madam, would you like breakfast?" And I was like, "Madam, like, who are you talking to?" And then I realised it was me she was talking to and she wanted to make, and I was like, no, don't make me breakfast. And she insisted. And then I woke up the next morning and I was like, because she said to me, you know, because I said to her, "Please don't make me breakfast." And she said, you know, "This is my job, I have to do it." So I woke up the next morning and earlier than her and made her breakfast. And that kind of made her laugh, and then we had a bit of a joke, and that's how we became friends. And she said to me, which I didn't realise at the time, what the depth of what it actually, or the significance of what she said. She said, "You can make me as many breakfasts as you want, it's not going to change anything." So over the days, that kind of broke the ice and we became friends. And I learned that she had come from Sri Lanka. She told me all about her home. She told me about her daughters. So she moved from Sri Lanka to Cyprus because her husband had died in a farming accident when her daughters were 2 years old and 4 years old. And she realised that she absolutely could not just deal with it on her, you know, she couldn't earn enough to bring up her daughters. So she made the really difficult decision to leave them with her mother-in-law and come to Cyprus. And when I met her, she hadn't returned home for 8 years. So she hadn't held her daughters in her arms for 8 years. She hadn't returned home for 8 years. And the way she was describing Sri Lanka to me just always made me cry, because she was saying it in a way that I could feel that longing for her to go home. I feel like crying now that I'm talking about it, because I'm remembering. But I just remember how sad she was. And she used to make this little suitcase and fill it up and send the suitcase home to her daughters. And they had, like, I don't know, little things that she'd collected for them, but she couldn't go home. So then she introduced me to her daughters, and it was through the iPad. And she'd talk to them and mother them through the iPad, but she couldn't touch them. But she would tell me so much. Like, she had this real kind of way of describing things. Like, she would just help me to imagine the smells and the tastes and the everything. And she'd make me this lovely food that, you know, and kind of explain to me where, you know, the tradition behind it and everything. And it was my friendship with Manaka that inspired me every step along the way when I was writing the character of Nisha, who's the main character in Songbirds. And it just made me think, meeting her made me think so much about what actually home meant and what it meant for her to not only be away from the place that she loved so much, but also to be away from the people that she loved, and especially her daughters. So I think for me, that was the thing that really inspired the novel, and her longing to go home and the fact that she couldn't, and what that
And
meant.
actually the sounds and smells and food is a big theme actually in all these books, so we'll come on to that later. But Melody?
So the story for Moth first came to me when I knew that I wanted to write a novel, and I knew that I wanted it to have a very strong political and historical background, but I also wanted it to explore the very intimate lives of individual people. And I was listening to a radio programme on Radio 4 based on Partition Voices, where they were interviewing the last remaining survivors of partition, and the way the interviewers talked about their experiences and about so many of them had not only lost their families and their homes, but they'd had to move from one side of the country to the other. When I started researching the topic of partition, and was really quite dismayed when I read the facts of, you know, several million people walking from one end of India to the other end and leaving behind their homes, and how just the little anecdotes that I read, and how, for example, you'd leave your home but you were so sure you'd come back that you'd leave your keys with the neighbour, or you'd bury all your jewels in the garden, and you know, you were so determined to come back, but then once they crossed that border and all the border controls went up, of course, then they couldn't go back. And so a lot of them would leave, like a husband would leave their wife and say, "I'm going to go and build a new home," or I'm going to go across and get the job. And as soon as they crossed, then they couldn't come back. So there's rupture. And the other thing that I read that really stuck with me that I tried to work into my novel was how objects became really valuable. So you'd have like your mum's cooking pot, or you'd have a pair of shoes that belonged to your daughter, and you'd carry these across the country. When you were walking, you'd get there, and these objects would suddenly mean everything, because all your entire childhood, your lost home, your family, everything was in those objects. And then all these layers of the different meanings of what a home meant all inspired me to write Moth.
God, I think I'm going to be crying by the end of this panel. Neema?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it was my own family background. So my grandparents went to Africa in the 1940s, to Kenya and Tanzania, actually. But we do have extended family who went to Uganda. And my parents were born in Kenya and Tanzania. So it was really important to me to write about those experiences, and I was quite surprised, actually, to find that there weren't, as far as I could tell, novels about this experience. And I suppose I was writing for my younger self. I mean, I obviously grew up reading a lot of books, but never saw that sort of aspect. And we do have this sort of unique subculture as East African Asians. You know, some of the words that we use are Swahili rather than Gujarati. The food we'll talk about more, but, you know, the infusion of different types of food together from different cultures. I wanted to bring all of that to life, and this extraordinary experience, you know, these 90 days that they were given to leave, in close memory, really. And I wrote a lot of the novel during Brexit and Trump, and so a lot of the experiences, I suppose, were infused with the ways that I was feeling about having been born in the UK, and feeling like I didn't fully 100% belong, and could something like this ever happen to us? And I think there is always that feeling, even for those of us who are born here. So that was what I was trying to do with the novel, really.
Well, mine's been a 20-year journey, so the reasons why I wrote it changed along the way. So I think initially I started to write it as a challenge to actually write a novel. And as the story developed, it was more about recording the generation of people that are passing away in the UK, particularly in Brixton, and to a form of graffiti to say they were here and they exist. So that was another aspect. Another aspect was to hopefully help people understand each other better, so that they can treat each other better, and hopefully develop more acts of kindness amongst each other.
I mean, a 20-year journey, did it change a lot from the beginning, from the actual idea that started?
The actual story I wrote in 6 months, the skeleton of the story, but the reasons for me to keep pushing and keep going changed and developed. Yeah.
So home is such a vast concept. I just wanted to have each of you let me know where you feel home is. It's a very loaded question, and everyone's going to have a different answer. But I'm going to ask Melody first.
Yeah, this is something that I think about a lot, because home for me has always been London and Brighton. And 3 years ago, I sold my business in order to be able to write the novel, and I decided that I would leave England and I would leave my friends, with the potential of actually not coming back. That I would go and try and have this whole new life for myself, where I really wanted to be on my own, and I wanted to just devote myself to writing and to experiencing, really immersing myself in the culture of the place I was in. And I was in India for that year, and I really struggled with missing friends and family in a way that I didn't think I would. And I was fine for the first 6 months, but by the end of the year, I was really quite desperate to come home, and I realised that the connections that you make with the people that you're close to, they're not that easy to break. So even though I specifically tried not to break them, but to sever them so that I could go and have this new life, I did end up coming back, because the connections, I think, the human connections, the intimacies that you have with people, these for me are what really make home, and they can be anywhere, but once they're forged, they're very difficult to walk away from.
And were you missing people a lot sooner than you expected? Was that a surprise?
Yeah, I was, actually, and I was really missing my godkids, because you realise that children bring such joy into your life, and they grow so much, and suddenly I was really aware that I wouldn't see them and that I'd miss out on their childhood, and that, you know, felt quite painful. So yeah, straight away I started missing people.
Rosanna?
Well, previously, before getting into writing, I worked as an engineer, so I travelled a lot, and I would go to countries, work there, but I'd always come back to the root, and the root being where my parents were, where my friends were, the school that I went to. So, so it through that experience, it solidified where home was for me, which was where my family was.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, primarily it's the UK. It's where I was born, and I would struggle to start again in either India or Kenya, to be honest. But actually, I feel like I have more than one home, and a lot of my family are here, but we also have close family in Kenya. And I know for my parents as well, you know, we feel that's our second home, not India. My mum didn't go to India till she was in her 40s. I didn't go until I was in my 20s. So I would say, if anywhere, that is my other home. And I think I went when I was very young. Like, there was a period where I didn't feel that this was my home. You know, people saying go back to your own country when you're a child and stuff, and that kind of all went away. And then, like I said, I've been feeling it again. And I used to cower to it a little bit, and now I've decided it doesn't really matter what anyone says. This is my home, and I'm a bit more defiant. I guess that's what comes with getting older. So it's a complicated question, and that's what I love about the fact that I do come really from more than one culture. It's a good thing. I'm trying to see it as a positive thing. Will I completely and entirely belong here? Not necessarily, but it's still in my heart, my home.
That's a good point. I don't think home has to be one defined thing.
It isn't for me.
No.
Yeah.
Florence.
For me, the question is quite an emotive one, because it pushes buttons that I've had to live with and cope with for my entire life. And that's mainly because when I was in Nigeria, that was meant to be my ancestral home. Yet, because my behaviours were so different and my attitudes to life was so different, having been formed by my early childhood, I never fit there. And I never really felt at home there. And then coming back to the UK, for the first few years at least, you know, you'll meet a stranger, you'd start chatting, and they'll say, "Where are you from?" And I'll say, "I'm from London." And they'll go, "But where are you really from?" And that hurt, and it hurt for a long time, because I was desperately trying to be as British as I could be, because I needed to belong somewhere, and yet everyone I was meeting was saying, "Where are you from?" So clearly I wasn't. And that really messed me up royally. Eventually, I kind of found myself along the way. In terms of where I now consider to be home, I accept that my ancestral home is Nigeria, and particularly amongst the Yoruba people, which is the ethnic group that my family come from. Home is where your ancestors are. And for them, anywhere else is not home. And if I were to say anywhere else was home, within that culture, that's probably seen as a little bit of a betrayal. So when I answer the question, I'm always conscious of that at the back of my mind. And yet the place where I feel most at home is England. It's where I've spent most of my life. It's where I've had my career. It's where I've raised my children. It's where my children, my grandchildren, and all my siblings live here. So actually, it's where my heart is, and that's here.
Is that the same for you, Christy?
Well, I was just thinking, so my parents were refugees, and they fled the war in Cyprus in 1974, and I was born here in the UK. And as I was growing up, lots of people would be like, "Oh, would you ever go back?" And I was like, "What do you mean back? Back where? I was born here." And, you know, I think, like, listening to what you were saying as well, I really felt like I needed to belong somewhere. So I think I tried even harder to be British. But then as I grew up, I realised, especially after my mum died about 12 years ago, I realised how important the cultural things were that they brought with them. And so I think And it reminds me a bit of what you were saying about like people hold on to things, but they also like hold on to the traditions, not just the objects, the traditions and the recipes. And, you know, so my mum had these recipes that she would make from her village. So everyone else that I met from her village would know how to make moussaka in a particular way. But if I met someone from another village, they'd make moussaka in a different way. And the same would go for drahana, and the same would go for egg lemon soup. So like all these things, they really held onto like they were lifelines. And especially after my mum died, I kind of got to the point where those things began and now mean so much to me. However, even when I do go back to Cyprus, see, it's like it's become that word back has kind of, you know, got into me and I use it. But when I go to Cyprus, because my dad lives there now, my mum was buried in Cyprus, one of my brothers lives in Cyprus, I go there, I enjoy it for about 3 weeks, but then I want to come home. And that's always the case, and this is home. But it wouldn't be home if it wasn't infused with all the things that my parents brought with them. So it's home only if it is what it is because of what it became, if you know, if that makes sense.
And actually, that leads me on. I really want to talk about food because food is one of my favourite things. But also, it's such an important element in terms of knowing where you belong and smells, you know, and even just if you pass somewhere and it smells, it can suddenly transport you right back. So can you tell me how food has impacted where you feel you belong and how you've passed that on to children or just friends and what cooking means to you in terms of belonging? I'm going to go with Melody because Melody used to own a cafe in Brighton. She's a former pastry chef, and Moth contains a lot of just gorgeous Indian food and drink. It's a very important element of the book, isn't it?
Yeah. I was raised, my mum's from Iran and my dad's from Pakistan, but I was born and raised in London in a single parent family with just my mum, and she is fiercely, fiercely proud of being Persian, and we were raised on Persian food. So I really remember when I was a lot younger being obsessed by the school lunches at school. I was the only person in my class who loved the school dinners because I was so desperate, again, for that sense of Britishness. I wanted like horrible lumpy custard and cold sponge, and I used to crave these lunches just because it made me feel like I belonged. And my mum would cook these beautiful meals and I'd like turn up my nose at all her cooking. And I remember having a conversation with a friend who was telling me about all the different types of potatoes they had in her house, and I was like, oh, we don't have potatoes, we have rice. And that was a real kind of thing of exploring it. But what was really interesting is when I opened my cafe over 10 years ago now, and I described it as having a very British and old school kind of Enid Blyton sense of like midnight feasts and that kind of thing in the types of cakes that I made. But over the years, I started to realise that I was using more and more Persian ingredients without meaning to. I was gravitating to pistachios, to quinces, to rosewater, and semolina instead of flour. And so my cooking gradually started taking on all those cultural resonances without me even attempting that. But it's so interesting to see how my taste buds gradually changed over the years. In Moth there's a lot of food, there's a lot of cooking. I wanted to show how, in terms of rupture, in terms of upheaval and trauma, how women can create such a lifeline through food, through the hearth, through feeding and nourishing their families. And whilst there's a lot of noise about how the men are out there fighting and butchering each other and, you know, creating all the political disturbances, it's the women who are feeding the families, it's the women who are keeping the houses warm. So really they're the ones fighting the real battle, I think, and food is such a big part of that. Yeah.
And there is, I must just let you know, in The Observer in a couple of weekends' time, there is a beautiful piece by Melody on food, and it is mouth-watering. So I would urge you to look that up. And on the 15th of August it's out. What about you, Neema?
Yeah, I'm the same, and just as a reader anyway, I like to feel hungry when I'm reading. I find it really frustrating when authors write things like, then they ate dinner, and then it moves on. I need to know what they ate exactly. So yeah, there's a lot of food in my book, just to warn you. Yeah, I wanted to obviously demonstrate some of those cultural things as well. So for us, there's things like cassava cooked in coconut and cumin and seeds. So it's a mix of African and Asian staples, and even when they came to the UK, so we still eat this thing, and some people are going to be horrified, I know, but I promise you it's nice, baked bean curry. So it's cooked with cumin and coriander, and it's delicious. But that is what happens. People sort of adapt things, but I absolutely agree with and have explored how you connect to home through food. So if you can't be in a place, and even for me, I haven't lived any length of time in Africa, but I am connected to my family, my parents, even my grandparents, and my ancestors, really, just by eating a meal. It's quite extraordinary in a lot of ways. Or taken back to Kenya when I had holidays and things like that. So yeah, it's a really important part of the book.
And I guess food helps you connect with people just to get a sense of belonging who you don't know that well, because eating together is such an important thing, isn't it? What about you, Rosanna?
I think I learnt flexibility through food because, both my grandparents, one from the Caribbean side and the other from Jamaica and Nigeria, they lived around the corner from each other when I was, first they were neighbours and then they lived around the corner from each other as I was growing up. So, you'd go to school, you'd have the school meals, apple crumble, all that roly-poly, and then you'd go around to your grandmother's, you'd have rice and peas, or you have okra and gari, so I was brought up always with an interchange of different...
And you liked them both?
I liked all of it. I like food. And then also, then you got friends who, within my, you had Asian friends, so you'd go around to their house, they would have their food. Food teaches you, I think, a lot about flexibility, acceptance, and different ways of being.
That's so true. Yeah. I'm feeling a bit nostalgic now. I'm missing my grandmother because I just remembered that she used to make, and I mentioned this in Songbirds. She used to make these little sesame fingers that she used to put cinnamon and cloves, and so the whole house would end up smelling like cinnamon and cloves. And I also remember that my mum and my grandma used to cook together, and then my auntie would come and then she'd join in, and then they'd try and teach me something or my brother something, and somehow everyone would be joined in with the cooking. And I've been feeling like, even quite lately, I feel like I miss that, I miss that kind of bond of the people coming together and cooking together. But you can always have it with new people. But I think what was lovely about when my grandmother was still alive, when my mother was still alive, is that they were bringing the traditions. But I've taken some of those, and I remember how to make. Once, me and my brother decided that we were going to make the koftedes. They're these meatballs that my mum made, and we wanted the recipe to be exactly the same. So his wife sat in the living room while me and him made 15 different batches of these meatballs, and we got her to try each one because she tried my mum's one. So we'd try this one and then go back and try this one.
And did they match up?
Well, finally we found one that almost matched up, but it wasn't quite the same. But just that kind of joy of trying to get those exact flavors that she used to kind of, so I think food is, and I loved the roly-polies and the custards and the shepherd pie that had the lumps in it. I loved all that. And then I'd go home and there'd be beans with, just made in the proper Greek way, and then I'd have to eat that, and sometimes I didn't like it, and there was some that I liked. So it's such a huge part of my life, but it just reminds me of the people that I loved. It so brings back those memories.
I mean, my mum is here actually, and she's an incredible cook. And I will follow her recipes to the letter, and my kids will still be like, it's not as good as, it's all right. It's very infuriating.
Can we come round and eat?
I also wanted to move on to the theme of women in your books. I know we're going to have a quick reading from two of you, so I'm going to keep it brief. But I feel a very strong sense of the strength of women throughout your books and how they silently carry burdens and emotional baggage. So I wondered if, what thoughts you had and how important it was for you to tell those stories.
I guess there's a silence, I'll fill it. So it was really important, both from my own background. I come from a family of strong Asian women, and it was very important for me to try and refute the sometimes stereotypical vision of an Asian woman. It's not been my experience, and I really wanted to portray that in the main character of Asha, who's in her 20s, and then Jaya, who's in her 40s or 50s, actually 50s. And they're both loosely inspired by my mother and grandmother, I guess. But also through my research, what I came across was quite surprising in terms of, this was quite a patriarchal culture, it still is really. And the women might work until they were married, but then they would definitely be at home and they wouldn't necessarily work at all. And that was expected. But then when they came from Uganda to England and were obviously forced into these different circumstances, it was often the women who maybe thrived. They had to go out and they had to work. And it was often the men who suffered because their positions, which were are normally set out from a very young age, so you're going to be the breadwinner and you're going to do this, it all kind of fell apart. And that was fascinating to me because it's not necessarily the image that I have of men and women in Asian society, and it's not necessarily my experiences. I come from quite a traditional family, so I wanted to explore all of that and make sure that it was clear that the women not only thrived, but they changed a lot. And for both, I'm not really giving anything away. These were positive experiences for a lot of the women in the book, and I really wanted to look at how that happened.
I'll throw it out there to any of you.
When I was doing my research for the novel, one of the things that really stayed with me and is actually the core of the novel was the amount of women in a space of maybe a couple of months in the summer of 1947, the amount of women who were raped and abducted, well into sort of 1 million, raped and abducted, and then they were then forced into these arranged marriages with the people who had abducted them, and then these women would have children, and at some point they would be returned back to their families, and a lot of them had to then give up their children because their birth families wouldn't accept them. And the more I read about this, the more dismayed I became, but also by the fact that the men were using the women during that time as a way of polluting the bloodlines of the other religion. So then in a way, the women were becoming a currency for a war that they hadn't even tried to start, that they weren't interested in starting, and yet they were being used. And just this idea that you would use a woman in order to pollute the bloodline of someone else, I found really distressing. And the more I read, the more I also realised that there was no interviews by these women, there was such a huge culture of shame around what had happened to these women, and it was never discussed or written. And then I started reading fiction around that time, and realised that nothing had ever been written by the point of view of these women or exploring their experiences, and that's why for me it was very important, not only that I write about these women, but in Moth there are many different types of women. There's an intellectual, there's a young girl, there's a small child, a right-winged grandmother, a more left-wing aunt, there's a cleaner, there's a cook. And so just to try and have the voice of all of these women to then create the collective voice seemed the only way to do it for me.
Christy and Florence, did you?
Yeah. In my story, I think that the main character that sort of shaped my life and in many ways who I became for good and for bad was my grandmother. And she had very strong views about who I should be. And I was miles away from being that person. And so all our interactions over the years were based on her trying to reform my character. And it was fascinating because I was defiant to the letter. And her greatest fear in life was that I wouldn't be biddable. And I'd grow up into the kind of woman who couldn't stay married because I wouldn't conform to the culture's expectations of women and of wives. And I remember growing up with her voice constantly at the back of my head saying, she won't stay married. She won't stay married. And for the culture, there was no bigger disgrace than for you to get divorced. And it's been fascinating because my husband and I celebrated our 40th wedding anniversary this year. And thank you. And yeah, 40 years is longer than you get for life, you know, when you get sent to jail. And all through those years, that voice was still at the back of my mind. I'll show her. So, you know, it's fascinating in that culture, even though men enjoy higher status than women do. And to be fair, in Yoruba culture, women do enjoy a far higher status than many African cultures that I know about. They can inherit, they can work, they can do all sorts of things. But men are still that little bit higher. Men don't have to do domestic jobs. Women do them all. And yet you couldn't stay at home and say you just want to look after your family. In that culture, you do that and you work. Otherwise, you're drained on your husband and his family. So it's amazing that the women are strong because they have to do all these roles and they have to do them successfully. If you raise a child and the child turns out okay, it's his father's. If you raise the child and the child's a disgrace, it's its mother's. And I grew up in this culture where, you know, my parents, you know, if I did something wrong, my mom would say, your child. You know, it's always the other's child when you've done something wrong. And it's funny because that's passed down the generations, and my husband and I sometimes do it in jesting, your daughter. It's like, didn't we both do this together? So that's been funny. And I see the women as the custodians of the culture. And so if things are to change, it's got to start with the women.
Amen to that. Christy?
So I think when I was writing the novel, I became really interested in how women can sometimes silence women. I remember when I decided that I was going to write Songbirds, and one of my aunties, who's actually very liberal, we've had loads of conversations about things together over the years, she said, what are you writing now after Beekeeper? And I said, well, I'm really interested in what happened to the domestic workers. She said, Christy, I'm really shocked. You know, these women don't have any roots. They don't care about their families. And I said to her, do you really think that? And the thing is, there was this sort of narrative, and I think people just kind of followed it without actually thinking. And so when I heard about the fact that the women had gone missing and the two children and that the police hadn't searched for them, I was angry because I wasn't shocked. And the reason I wasn't shocked is because I'd been in so many different environments where a domestic worker would be there bringing up the children of another woman, but the other woman would kind of dismiss them as if they weren't really human, or they weren't really, I don't know, they somehow were different, or they were the other, that, you know, maybe they felt they weren't educated in the same way, or they weren't this in the same way, or that in the same way. So they found ways to diminish that person. And so when I started writing the book, I thought, well, isn't it interesting that women are actually silencing women in some way? And there's a point in the story where Petra learns that actually, without realizing, she had fallen into this way of seeing and this way of being and in this way of treating other women. And there is also a point in the narrative where the women themselves stand up and find their voice. But it takes some kind of eruption for that to happen, and something horrific for that to happen. So that, I think that's what I was really interested in. Like, why do we silence each other when we should be supporting each other? And yet it happens, and it was real, and I saw it, and it made me sad. And then when I kept questioning my auntie, she actually started questioning herself, and she was like, why am I thinking like this? And it was just the fact that it almost became like a habit without realizing it. You fall into, and that can be so dangerous. That falling into a certain way of thinking without realizing it can be so dangerous. So I think I really wanted to explore that in Songbirds.
That's a really good point. We're running out of time. We could talk for hours about this. But we are going to have 2 short readings. The only reason we're not having readings in all the panel is firstly time, and secondly I did spring it on them. So we didn't have all the books here to read, so please forgive me. But I will kick off with Rosanna, and then we'll have a short reading from Florence.
Well, my reading is very short, and it comes out of the question about what are you, where are you from, your Britishness, and it's a passage, something that Michael says within the book, where he's talking to Ngozi, who's when they meet up, and Michael. So it says, Michael nods his head, deep in thought. You're right. We all have a culture, even us, Black British. You can't properly see it yet because we're still like toddlers in comparison. Still need to rely on our parents and our grandparents. But slowly we're learning to walk, to stand on our own 2 feet, evolving an identity of our own, a culture of our own. So, so that is how I feel about my Britishness, that, you know, I'm British, but all that goes, it's not just one thing that goes into me, it's all, I'm a melting pot.
It's very true. Thank you.
I've taken the reading from somewhere close to the end of the book. My memoir was titled Coconut, and a lot of people ask me, why did you choose that name? Certainly within Black communities, it's sometimes seen as a slur, and kind of describes someone who's Black on the outside, but, you know, white on the inside, i.e., you know, you've either denied your cultural heritage or you've taken on white, inverted commas, characteristics. And in many ways, at some point in my life, that was the kind of person people perceived me to be, and probably the kind of person I thought I was. One of the things that kept me going through all those years in Nigeria was that my father had promised that he would one day allow me to visit my foster mother in England. And when I was 17, he let me come back, and that dream came true. And I spent 6 glorious weeks in the summer with her. And this reading's taken from because I had to go back to Nigeria, so it's taken from my musings when I got on the plane that was about to take me back to Nigeria. My long-awaited homecoming had whirled past like a hurricane. Now that my last day in London loomed, my thoughts became contemplative. That night, as I went to bed, I pondered the bundle of contradictions my trip had turned out to be. I had shared little of the past 12 years with Nan, Pop, and Tom. Some memories were still too raw to dwell on, and I felt a powerful sense of loyalty to my family. But I told them about my studies and about Bade. Only they knew I'd promised to marry him. Why was I able to tell them, but not a single person back in Nigeria? Aside from the odd looks, I hadn't experienced any racism in London. But I wasn't blind to the fact that my colour set me apart. Even Nan called me coloured, and she loved me. I knew my parents loved me too, as did some of my extended family. But they didn't understand me, and to them, I was also different. As a Black person, could I live in England and be successful, or was I hankering after a fool's dream? The Silvers said they found being Black in England challenging, but they coped. The Costas family, who looked like fairly recent immigrants, were running a thriving business. But the Costas are not Black, the voice in my head echoed. That afternoon, I gave Pop a hug and patted Diddly-Doo, the dog, before climbing into the taxi taking me to the airport. The creature had eventually accepted my presence. Nan and Tom climbed in with me, and as the taxi moved off, I waved back at the silhouette of Pop's lonely figure in the upstairs window. Pop was my foster dad. I would never see him again. At the departure gate, I turned for one last hug. I knew I'd be back, I just didn't know when. Although still sprightly, Nan wasn't young anymore, and I might never see her again. I wrapped my arms around her, trying to infuse into the embrace every ounce of love I felt for this woman. She squeezed me tight. You keep writing, yeah? I blinked away the tears seeping out of the corner of my eyes. Tom offered me a tissue. In return, I gave him a quick hug before picking up my luggage. and walking into the crowd. Despite my misgivings about the racial aspects of living in England, the summer was the most contented I'd ever been. A big part of me wanted to stay in London, but I was not one to break promises. I'd invested 2 hard years in my studies and I didn't believe in wasting my effort. I settled into my aeroplane seat, mulling on the juxtaposition between the two cultures pulling me apart. Who was I, really? Nigerian? British? Both? The difficult years had hardened me in many ways, but beneath the brusque, uncaring facade I presented to the world, I cared about life and the people important to me. The image of a coconut flowed through my head, with its tough brown outer shell and its fleshy white inner core. It was known as the tree of life, every part useful. Surely that was the key. I didn't need to be one or the other. I could be both and happy. But which of the two countries would let me?
Thank you. I think that's the perfect way to end. So not only am I now starving, but I'm also going to probably cry my eyes out. So thank you to all of you. Rosanna, Neema, Melody, Christy and Florence. And all the books are in the Waterstones tent and the authors will be signing them. So please make your way over there. Thank you so much.